Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The satellite phone's harsh ring cut through the pre-dawn silence of the ranger station like a blade through silk. Robert Martinez had been awake for 20 minutes already, nursing his third cup of coffee and watching the mist rise from Lake Crescent through the window. Sleep had become elusive over the past 3 years, ever since Cascade Falls. Olympic National Forest, Ranger Martinez speaking. The voice that answered was fractured, desperate. "Please, you have to help us. Our daughter, she's been missing since yesterday afternoon. The police said to call you because she was hiking in your area." Robert set down his coffee, muscle memory already reaching for his incident pad. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. What's your daughter's name?" Samantha Chen. She's 22. She was supposed to be back by 6 last night. She never misses dinner, never. She's been hiking the Sol Duc trail system for years. She knows it like..." The woman's voice cracked. The Sol Duc. Robert's pen paused above the paper. That was less than 15 miles from where it had happened before, where the voices had started. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to need specific details. Which trail did Samantha take?" "The Aurora Ridge Trail. She wanted to photograph the old growth grove before the autumn light changed. She had her GPS, her emergency beacon, everything. But the beacon, it went dark around 4 p.m. yesterday. Aurora Ridge." Robert's throat tightened. The trail skirted the edge of the area locals had been avoiding for decades, long before his own encounter. The area where sounds carried wrong, where compasses spun without magnetic interference, where 3 separate search and rescue operations had ended with more questions than answers. "I'm organizing a search team immediately," Robert heard himself say, though his hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. "Can you meet me at the Sol Duc Hot Springs parking area in 2 hours?" After ending the call, Robert stood motionless in the growing dawn light. Through the window, the Olympic Mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in clouds that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Somewhere in those ancient forests a young woman was missing, and somewhere else, in the spaces between the trees, other things were stirring. He reached for his gear bag, checking contents he could inventory in his sleep. GPS units, emergency flares, medical supplies, emergency food rations. His fingers lingered over the small digital recorder he'd started carrying 3 years ago, the one that had captured sounds no human throat could make. The drive to Sol Duc took him past familiar landmarks that now felt foreign. Every shadow seemed deeper, every gap between trees wider than it should be. The forest itself felt watchful, as if thousands of eyes were tracking his progress along the winding mountain road. Mrs. Chen was waiting in the parking lot, a small woman with graying hair and eyes red from crying. Beside her stood a tall man Robert assumed was Samantha's father, his face carrying the particular strain of someone trying to hold his family together through force of will alone. "Ranger Martinez?" Mrs. Chen approached before he'd fully stepped from his truck. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "This is what I do, ma'am. Now I need to understand exactly what happened yesterday." Mr. Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carefully controlled. "Samantha left our cabin at 10 a.m. She said she wanted to catch the morning light in the old growth section, about 3 miles up the Aurora Ridge Trail. She's an experienced hiker, carries proper equipment, knows wilderness protocol." Robert nodded, making notes. "Has she hiked this specific trail before?" "Many times. It's one of her favorites because of the photography opportunities. The way the light filters through those massive cedars." Mrs. Chen's voice caught. "When did you realize something was wrong?" 6:30, Mr. Chen said immediately. "She promised to call when she reached the car, let us know she was heading back to the cabin. When we didn't hear from her by 7, I drove to the trailhead. Her car was still there, but no sign of her." Robert felt that familiar cold weight settling in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when the first reports had come in about the missing geology students 3 years ago. "Did she mention anything unusual about the area recently?" Anything that seemed different or concerning? The parents exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. There was something, Mrs. Chen said slowly. Last month, when she hiked the same trail, she said she heard voices in the forest. Children's voices, she thought, maybe from a school group. But when she investigated, she couldn't find anyone. The weight in Robert's chest turned to ice. She said it was probably just sound carrying strangely through the trees. Mr. Chen added quickly, "You know how acoustics work in dense forest." Robert knew exactly how acoustics worked in dense forest. He also knew how they stopped working entirely in certain places, where sounds became something else, where human voices blended into harmonies that no living throat could produce. "I'm going to head up the trail now," he said, shouldering his pack. "I need you both to stay here. If other family members arrive, keep them at the parking area. I'll radio every 30 minutes with updates." The Aurora Ridge trailhead began innocuously enough. Well-maintained path, clear trail markers, the comfortable sounds of a living forest. Squirrels chittered in the canopy, woodpeckers hammered distant rhythms, and somewhere a creek burbled over stones worn smooth by centuries of water. But as Robert climbed higher, following Samantha's likely route toward the old growth grove, the sounds began to change. It started subtly. The creek's babble took on an almost conversational quality, as if it were murmuring words just below the threshold of comprehension. The woodpecker's rhythm became more complex, like Morse code tapping out messages in an unknown language. At mile marker 2, Robert stopped and checked his GPS. The device showed his location clearly, but the elevation reading fluctuated wildly, climbing from 1,200 feet to 3,400 feet and back again within seconds, despite the fact that he hadn't moved. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Martinez. I'm 2 miles up Aurora Ridge, no sign of the missing hiker yet. Trail conditions are good. Visibility moderate due to canopy cover." Static answered him, punctuated by what sounded almost like whispers. "Base, do you copy?" More static, and then a voice that might have been the dispatcher or might have been something else entirely. "Copy, Martinez. Continue search. Be careful up there." Robert lowered the radio slowly. In 15 years as a forest ranger, dispatch had never told him to be careful. They discussed weather conditions, emergency protocols, backup procedures, but never gave vague warnings that sounded like personal concern. The old growth grove opened before him like a natural cathedral. Massive western red cedars, some nearly 1,000 years old, rose like pillars supporting a ceiling of green so dense that noon sunlight became twilight shadows. This was where Samantha had been photographing, where her beacon had gone dark. Robert found the first sign of her presence almost immediately, scuff marks in the soft earth near the base of a particularly massive cedar, the kind of marks left by someone setting down a heavy camera bag. He photographed the scene with his department-issued camera, then began a systematic search pattern radiating outward from the disturbance. 20 feet from the cedar, he found the second sign. Samantha's water bottle, cap missing, contents long since absorbed by the forest floor. But it was the location that made Robert's hands shake as he bagged the evidence. The bottle lay at the exact center of a perfect circle where nothing grew. The dead zone was roughly 15 feet in diameter, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by the lush undergrowth typical of old-growth forest. Robert had seen similar formations before, fairy rings caused by fungal networks depleting soil nutrients. But this one was different. The earth wasn't merely barren, it seemed scorched, though he detected no smell of fire or chemical burn. More disturbing was the silence within the circle. The forest sounds that had been his constant companion, bird calls, insect hum, the whisper of wind through needles, died completely at the circle's edge. Standing at its center, Robert felt as if he'd stepped into a soundproof chamber. He keyed his radio again. "Base, I found evidence of the missing hiker. Water bottle and signs of disturbance at grid reference." He consulted his GPS and frowned. The device showed no signal, though the sky was clearly visible through the canopy overhead. From somewhere behind him came the sound of a camera shutter clicking. Robert spun around, hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, though he knew bullets would be useless against what he feared he might face. The sound had been distinct, unmistakable, the rapid-fire clicking of a digital SLR camera in burst mode. "Samantha," he called out, though his voice sounded flat and dead in the unnatural quiet. "Samantha Chen, this is Ranger Martinez. If you can hear me, call out." The camera sounds came again, this time from his left, then immediately from his right, as if multiple photographers were documenting his every move from different angles. But the forest remained empty of human presence. Robert forced himself to continue the search pattern, moving in widening spirals around the dead circle. His training told him to document everything, maintain protocol, radio for backup. His experience from 3 years ago told him that backup wouldn't help, that protocol was meaningless in places where the normal rules had been suspended. At the edge of his third spiral, he found Samantha's camera. The expensive Canon DSLR hung from its strap on a low branch, as if someone had carefully placed it there for safekeeping. The camera body appeared undamaged, but when Robert examined the LCD screen, his throat constricted. The last image showed a self-portrait of Samantha, smiling broadly in the dappled sunlight of the grove. But behind her, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, dozens of faces looked back at the camera. Old faces, young faces, male and female, all with expressions of desperate longing. Robert scrolled back through the images. The faces appeared in every shot Samantha had taken in the grove, growing more numerous and more distinct with each photograph. In the earliest images, they were barely suggestions of human features in the play of light and shadow. In the final shots, they pressed forward, as if trying to climb through the camera lens itself. The last photograph on the memory card wasn't one Samantha had taken. It showed Robert himself, standing in the dead circle examining her water bottle. The timestamp indicated it had been captured 30 seconds ago. His hands trembling, Robert looked up from the camera to find himself surrounded. They weren't fully visible, not in the way living people were visible. They appeared as overlapping transparencies, like double-exposed photographs, dozens of figures occupying the same space without interfering with each other. Men in logging clothes from the 1920s shared the same ground as women in hiking gear from the 1970s. Children in Boy Scout uniforms from the 1950s layered over teenagers in modern outdoor clothing. All of them were speaking at once. The sound that emerged from the collective was unlike anything Robert had ever heard. A symphony of human voices layered so densely that individual words became lost in the harmonic complexity. He caught fragments, pleadings for help, descriptions of being lost, calls for parents and loved ones, but the voices blended and separated in waves, creating patterns that seemed almost musical. Robert recognized some of the faces from old missing persons files, cases that had gone cold decades ago, the Boy Scout troop that had vanished during a 1952 camping trip, the logger who had disappeared while checking tree boundaries in 1923, the geology students from 3 years ago whose voices had first started haunting Robert's dreams. And there, at the center of the collective, was Samantha Chen. She appeared more solid than the others, as if her recent addition to their number granted her greater presence in the physical world. Unlike the others, she seemed to recognize Robert as a living person, rather than simply another lost soul to welcome into their community. "Ranger Martinez," she said, her voice somehow audible despite the chorus surrounding them both. "I've been trying to call for help, but nobody hears us. Nobody ever hears us." "I hear you," Robert managed, though speaking felt like forcing words through cotton. "Your parents are looking for you. They're worried sick." Samantha's expression crumpled. "I know. I can see them sometimes when they're crying. I want to go home, but I don't remember how I got here. None of us do. We just are." The collective's voices rose and fell like wind through the canopy, and Robert began to understand the pattern. They weren't simply speaking. They were echoing each other, their individual words and phrases blending into a recursive loop that fed back on itself, growing stronger and more complex with each iteration. "How long have you been here?" Robert asked Samantha, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't know. Time works differently. Sometimes it feels like minutes, sometimes like years. The others say they've been here forever, but they also say they just arrived." She gestured toward the overlapping figures. We're all here together, but we're also all alone. Robert understood now why his GPS had malfunctioned, why his radio received only static, why the forest itself seemed to pulse with unnatural rhythm. The collective existed outside normal space and time, anchored to this location by some tragedy he didn't yet understand, growing stronger with each new addition to their number. "What happened to all of you?" he asked. The collective's voices shifted, becoming more agitated, more discordant. Samantha winced as if the sound caused her physical pain. "There was something wrong with this place long before we came," she said. "Something hungry. It feeds on people who get lost, but not their bodies. Their sense of belonging somewhere. We're still here, but we're not anywhere. We exist, but we don't exist anywhere that matters." Robert felt the familiar weight of terror settling over him, the same dread that had paralyzed him during his previous encounter with forces beyond natural explanation. But this time, something else rose alongside the fear, a burning anger at the unfairness of it all. These weren't monsters or demons. They were people who had come to the forest seeking beauty, adventure, solitude, and had instead been trapped in a state that was neither life nor death. "There has to be a way out," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Samantha or to himself. "Maybe there is." Samantha's image flickered, becoming less distinct as the collective's voices rose around them. "But I think it requires someone who isn't lost, someone who knows the way home." The voices reached a crescendo that seemed to make the ancient trees themselves vibrate, and suddenly Robert understood what they were asking of him. The collective didn't want to trap him. They wanted him to lead them out, but doing so would require him to enter their state of existence, to become lost himself, in order to guide the lost. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. He thought of Samantha's parents waiting in the parking lot below. He thought of all the other families who had waited and wondered and never received answers. He thought of his own nightmares, the voices that had haunted him since his first encounter with the supernatural, and realized that running from them had never made them weaker, only louder. Robert pulled the small digital recorder from his pack and set it on the ground, pressing record. Whatever happened next, there needed to be some evidence, some explanation for the families who deserved to know their loved ones hadn't simply abandoned them. "I'm going to try something," he announced, addressing both Samantha and the collective as a whole. "But I need you to trust me." He closed his eyes and let himself remember the path he had taken to reach this grove. Not the physical trail with its markers and switchbacks, but the emotional journey, the decision to help a desperate family, the choice to face his fears rather than flee from them, the moment-by-moment commitment to do what was right, even when it terrified him. When he opened his eyes, the forest had changed. The dead circle beneath his feet now pulsed with soft light, and the trees around the grove had become translucent, revealing a complex network of paths that existed in dimensions the human eye wasn't meant to perceive. Some paths led deeper into the supernatural maze that had trapped the collective. Others curved back toward the world of the living. "Follow me," Robert said, stepping toward the brightest of the return paths. "All of you, think about the people who love you, the places where you belong. Hold those thoughts and follow me home." The collective began to move as one entity, their overlapping forms streaming behind Robert like a procession of living memories. With each step away from the grove, they became more distinct, more individual, more real. The journey back felt both endless and instantaneous. Robert found himself walking through landscapes that shifted between familiar forest paths and impossible geometries that hurt to contemplate. The collective followed, their voices gradually separating from the recursive chorus into individual expressions of hope and determination. When they finally emerged into normal space and time, Robert found himself standing at the Aurora Ridge trailhead, disoriented and exhausted. The parking lot was full of emergency vehicles, search and rescue teams, paramedics, police cars. Someone must have called for backup when he'd failed to report in. Mrs. Chen spotted him first and ran across the asphalt, her face desperate with hope and terror. "Did you find her? Did you find Samantha?" Robert looked behind him, half expecting to see the collective still following, but the trail appeared empty. Then he noticed the other families beginning to arrive. Elderly couples, middle-aged parents, siblings and children who had driven for hours after receiving impossible phone calls from loved ones they hadn't heard from in years, decades. Samantha emerged from the forest last, solid and real and blinking in the afternoon sunlight as if waking from a long dream. She ran to her parents, and their reunion dissolved into tears and embraces, and words of gratitude that Robert knew he didn't deserve. Over the following hours, as the impossible reunions continued, Robert began to understand the true scope of what had occurred. The collective hadn't simply been freed, they had been returned to the specific moment and place where they belonged, scattered across decades but all arriving home within minutes of each other. The Boy Scout troop materialized at their 1952 campsite, confused but unharmed, their worried scoutmaster's radio crackling to life with reports of their safe return. The missing geology students walked out of the forest 3 years in the past, their professor's frantic search ending in relief and bewilderment. The logger from 1923 stumbled into his own time with stories of strange visions that would become local legend. Only Robert retained memory of what had truly transpired, along with the digital recorder that had somehow captured the collective's final chorus. Not the terrifying cacophony he had expected, but a harmony of human voices expressing gratitude and farewell. 3 months later, Robert still worked the Olympic National Forest, though he had requested reassignment to a different district. The Aurora Ridge Trail remained officially closed pending investigation, though the official reports mentioned only geological instability and equipment malfunctions. He kept the digital recorder in his desk drawer, listening to it on nights when sleep eluded him. But now, instead of bringing nightmares, the voices brought a strange comfort, proof that some lost things could be found, that some separations could be healed, that love and determination were forces more powerful than any supernatural trap. The forest itself had changed as well. The dead circle was gone, replaced by a ring of wildflowers that bloomed out of season. The old growth grove had become a place of pilgrimage for local families, though they couldn't quite explain why they felt drawn to leave offerings of photographs and letters among the massive cedar roots. Robert continued to have dreams, but they were different now. Not haunted voices calling for help, but messages of gratitude from people he had never met, living their lives in times and places he would never see, united by the shared experience of finding their way home through the darkness. On quiet nights when the mountain wind carried sounds that might have been voices or might have been imagination, Robert Martinez smiled and slept peacefully, knowing that some mysteries were meant to be solved not with logic or technology, but with the simple human decision to help others find their way back to where they belonged. James Hartwell's coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. The dispatch radio crackled with static as he stared at the topographical map spread across his kitchen table, red circles marking elevation points along the Elwha River Trail. His wife Sarah moved quietly behind him, packing his thermos with fresh coffee and 2 of the peanut butter sandwiches their 8-year-old daughter Emma had helped make the night before. "Promise me you'll be careful out there," Sarah whispered, her hand finding his shoulder. "Emma keeps asking when Daddy will be home for her soccer game Saturday." James covered her hand with his own, feeling the familiar weight of his wedding ring. "I'll be back Friday night, sweetheart. Ashley Morrison's only been missing 36 hours. Trail conditions are good, visibility's clear. This should be straightforward." The phone call had come at 4:30 a.m., shattering their peaceful morning routine. Margaret Morrison's voice had broken through the receiver like fractured glass. "Please, Ranger Hartwell. Ashley was supposed to call yesterday evening. She never misses check-ins, never. She has a 2-year-old son and she would never." The woman's composure had crumbled completely. "I know something's wrong." As a father himself, James had felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the protective instinct that made every missing person case personal. Ashley Morrison, 24, experienced day hiker, had set out Monday morning for what should have been an 8-hour circuit along the Salduke Hot Springs Trail. Her Honda Civic still sat in the trailhead parking lot, doors locked, emergency gear untouched in the trunk. "Ranger Hartwell, this is dispatch. Weather Service is updating conditions for the Olympic Peninsula. Low pressure system moving in faster than anticipated. You've got maybe 12 hours of clear visibility before fog rolls in thick. James clicked his radio. Copy, dispatch. I'm heading out now. Estimated time on trail, 8 to 10 hours depending on findings. Sarah walked him to the door, and for a moment they stood together watching the sunrise paint the peaks of the Cascade Range in shades of rose and gold. Their own little world felt secure, warm, unbreakable. Give Emma a kiss for me when she wakes up, James said, shouldering his pack. Tell her Daddy's bringing someone home. The Honda Civic looked abandoned rather than parked, dew beating on its windshield like tears. James walked a slow perimeter, noting details. Driver's seat adjusted for someone around 5'4", coffee cup in the center console still half full, phone charger plugged into the dash outlet. Ashley's emergency contact form listed her mother Margaret and a 2-year-old son named Tyler, 2 years old. The same age Emma had been when she'd first called him Daddy instead of Dada. James started up the trail, his practiced eye reading the forest like a familiar book. Douglas fir and western hemlock created a cathedral ceiling overhead, their ancient trunks disappearing into morning mist. The trail surface showed clear boot prints in several sizes. Ashley's would be approximately size 7 according to her missing person report. At mile marker 2.3 he found them. Morel hiking boots, size 7 women's, distinctive tread pattern heading steadily uphill. The prints were clean, purposeful, showing no signs of distress or deviation from the main trail. That's a good sign, James murmured to himself, photographing the clearest impressions with his department-issued camera. Steady pace, confident stride. But at mile marker 4.1, something changed. The boot prints stopped mid-step, as if Ashley had simply vanished between one footfall and the next. James circled the area methodically, searching for any indication of where she might have gone. No drag marks, no signs of struggle, no blood, torn fabric, or disturbed vegetation. Just nothing. He expanded his search radius, checking every game trail, every fallen log that might suggest an alternate route. The forest pressed close around him, unusually quiet. Even the squirrels seemed subdued, their typical chattering replaced by an oppressive silence that made James increasingly uneasy. His radio crackled. Hartwell, this is base. Status report? Found clear tracks to mile 4.1, then they just end. No obvious explanation. Continuing search pattern northward. Copy. Weather update. Fog bank approaching faster than predicted. You've got maybe 6 hours of clear visibility left. 6 hours to find Ashley Morrison and bring her home to her little boy. James had been hiking for 5 hours when he first noticed the shadows weren't behaving correctly. It started subtly, a peripheral sense that darkness was moving independently of its source. When he'd turned to look directly, everything appeared normal. Tree shadows fell predictably eastward, rock formations cast appropriate shade patterns, his own shadow stretched behind him as the October sun climbed toward its zenith. But in his peripheral vision, shadows seemed to twist and reach with their own intention. He stopped beside a fallen cedar to drink water and eat one of Emma's sandwiches. The peanut butter tasted like home, like safety, like Saturday mornings, when his biggest concern was whether Emma's soccer team would win their game. Ashley? He called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Ashley Morrison, if you can hear me, please respond. Your family is worried. The echo came back wrong. Instead of his own voice bouncing cleanly off rock faces, the sound seemed to fragment and multiply, creating layers of calls that didn't quite match his words. It reminded him uncomfortably of the time Emma had gotten lost in a department store, and he'd heard her voice calling Daddy from every direction at once. James keyed his radio. Base, this is Hartwell. I'm at mile 7.2, coordinates 47.9342, 123.8974. Still no sign of Morrison. Weather conditions? Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequency and power levels. Nothing. He checked his satellite GPS unit. Signal lost. Searching for satellites. That's impossible, James muttered, tapping the device. Olympic National Forest had excellent satellite coverage, and he'd used GPS successfully on this same trail dozens of times. For the first time since leaving the trailhead, James felt genuinely unsettled. As a forest ranger with 12 years' experience, he'd dealt with equipment failures before, but never a complete communication blackout in clear weather with no canopy interference. He looked up at the October sky, noting how the light seemed different than it should be at midday. The sun appeared dimmed as if filtered through glass, and the shadows beneath the trees had taken on an unusual depth, creating pools of blackness that his eyes couldn't quite penetrate. "Help me." James spun around, heart hammering. The voice had been clear, female, coming from somewhere ahead on the trail. "Ashley? Ashley Morrison?" He jogged forward, scanning the forest methodically. "Keep talking. I'm Ranger Hartwell. I'm here to help you. Please, I can't find my way." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, drifting between the trees like fog. James followed the sound, pushing through undergrowth that grew increasingly dense despite the maintained trail he'd been following moments before. When he looked back, the trail had disappeared. Dense forest surrounded him on all sides, with no indication of which direction he'd come from or where the main trail might be. Towering Douglas firs blocked most of the sky, creating a maze of identical-looking corridors between massive trunks. "This is impossible," James breathed, reaching for his compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. His GPS continued showing signal lost, and his radio produced only static, but Ashley's voice continued calling, "I'm so cold. Tyler needs me to come home." Tyler, her 2-year-old son. James pushed deeper into the forest, driven by the same paternal instinct that would make him move mountains to reach Emma if she were in danger. Every father understood that desperation, the way it could override logic and self-preservation. The shadows between the trees had grown impossibly dark for mid-afternoon, creating voids that seemed to swallow light entirely. As James pushed through ferns and undergrowth, he began to notice that his own shadow was behaving strangely, stretching and contracting independently of his movements, sometimes pointing in directions that didn't correspond to any light source. "Help me, please." Ashley's voice was weaker now, fading in and out like a radio station losing signal. James crashed through a particularly dense thicket and found himself in a small clearing he'd never seen before, despite years of hiking these forests. In the center of the clearing stood a massive cedar stump, easily 12 feet in diameter, its surface blackened as if by ancient fire. The wood was so dark it seemed to absorb light, creating a pool of shadow that hurt to look at directly. And circling the stump were hiking boots, dozens of pairs arranged in perfect concentric rings like some twisted offering. Men's boots, women's boots, children's boots, ranging from new to decades old. Some pairs were so weathered they were barely recognizable as footwear. Among them, James spotted a pair of Merrell hiking boots, size 7 women's, with the same distinctive tread pattern he'd been following all morning. Ashley's boots. James approached the boot circle with his service weapon drawn, though he couldn't have explained what he expected to shoot. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, some kind of local tradition, or perhaps evidence of illegal activity that would require law enforcement intervention. But the shadows surrounding the clearing moved independently of wind or sunlight, reaching toward him like grasping fingers. "Ashley Morrison," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Are you here? I'm a park ranger. Your family sent me." The response came from directly behind him. "She can't answer anymore." James spun around, weapon raised, but found himself face to face with a woman who looked exactly like the photograph Margaret Morrison had provided. Ashley appeared physically unharmed, but somehow diminished, as if she were a photograph that had been left in sunlight too long. "Thank God," James breathed, lowering his weapon. "I'm Ranger James Hartwell. Your mother called us. Are you injured? We need to get you back to the trailhead immediately." Ashley tilted her head with an expression of mild confusion. "Back? But I'm helping now. I'm calling others home just like they called me." "Others?" James looked around the clearing again, noting details he'd missed before. The boot arrangement wasn't random. It formed a spiral pattern with the newest pairs on the outside and the oldest, most deteriorated pairs near the center. "Ashley, how long have you been out here?" Time is different now. Tyler was 2 when I left, but he's been 2 for such a long time. Her voice carried the cadence of her mother's phone call, but emptied of all warmth. Would you like to see him? He's just through there. She pointed toward what appeared to be a gap between 2 massive cedar trunks, but as James looked more closely, he realized he was seeing not a space between trees, but an absence, a doorway-shaped void that seemed to lead into absolute nothingness. Ashley, listen to me carefully. You've been missing for over 30 hours. You're suffering from exposure and possibly dehydration. Let me help you get home to Tyler. Home. Ashley repeated the word as if she'd never heard it before. I thought I was going home. I followed the voices calling me just like you did, just like they all did. James felt ice forming in his stomach. What voices? The ones that sound like the people we love most. Mine sounded like Tyler crying for his mommy. Yours sounds like Emma calling for her daddy. As if summoned by Ashley's words, James heard his daughter's voice drifting from somewhere deeper in the forest. Daddy? Daddy? Where are you? I'm scared, Daddy. Every instinct James possessed screamed at him to run toward that voice, to find his little girl and protect her from whatever had frightened her. His feet moved without conscious permission, carrying him toward the tree line. She's not here, James, Ashley said gently. Emma's safe at home with your wife, but the shadows know how much you love her and they use that love to call you deeper. James fought against the compulsion, forcing himself to stop. What are you talking about? What shadows? Look around you, Ranger. Really look. James studied the clearing more carefully and finally understood what had been bothering him about the light. The shadows weren't being cast by anything. They existed independently, pooling in areas where darkness had no business being. And within those shadow pools he could see movement, as if living things swam just beneath the surface of some lightless sea. They've been here longer than the trees, Ashley continued conversationally. Longer than the mountains. They feed on connection, on love, on the bonds that tie us to home. The stronger the bond, the sweeter the taste. Daddy, please. I need you. Emma's voice was closer now, coming from the direction of the shadow doorway between the cedars. James felt tears burning his eyes as every fiber of his being demanded he go to his daughter. She's home safe, he whispered to himself. She's home safe. Sarah's making dinner. Emma's doing homework at the kitchen table. She's safe. The shadows don't just feed, Ashley said. They recruit. Everyone who answers the call becomes part of the calling. I've been helping them bring others home, home to the darkness where families never have to worry about being separated again. James backed toward the edge of the clearing, trying to put distance between himself and the shadow doorway. But as he moved, he realized the circle of boots was expanding, growing larger with each step he took away from the center. You can't leave, James, not now that you've seen. The only choice is where you go, deeper into the shadows with the rest of us, or back to the world knowing what's waiting in every dark corner for the people you love. The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to rise, forming walls that stretched impossibly high, blocking out the pale afternoon sun. James found himself trapped in a cylinder of absolute darkness, with only the blackened cedar stump providing any reference point. And from that darkness, Emma's voice continued calling, Daddy, I'm lost. Please find me. James stood beside the ancient cedar stump, his service weapon feeling useless in his hand. Ashley Morrison waited patiently nearby, her presence somehow both comforting and terrifying. The walls of shadow pressed closer with each passing minute, narrowing his world to this small circle of tainted light. How many? He asked quietly. Families, Ashley replied. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The boots only represent the ones who were hiking alone when they heard the calling. There are others, families who went camping together and never came out, children who wandered away from picnic areas, elderly couples who got turned around on nature walks. They're all here now, all together, never to be separated again. James thought of Sarah and Emma, probably starting dinner preparations by now. Emma would be chattering about her day at school, demonstrating the new soccer moves she'd learned at practice. Sarah would be listening with patient attention while seasoning whatever she'd pulled from the freezer that morning. His normal life felt simultaneously precious and fragile, like holding a soap bubble in a hurricane. "What do you want from me?" James asked. "Want?" Ashley seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "We don't want anything. We're offering something. Freedom from the fear that keeps every parent awake at night. The fear that something will happen to the people you love. Here in the darkness, families are never separated. Children never grow up and move away. Spouses never grow distant or divorce. Love is preserved exactly as it was in the moment you arrived." "That's not life," James said. "That's death wearing life's mask." "Is it?" Ashley gestured toward the shadow doorway. "Look and see for yourself." Despite every instinct warning him against it, James found himself stepping toward the void between the cedar trunks. As he approached, the absolute darkness began to reveal shapes, figures moving in what appeared to be ordinary domestic scenes. He saw a family around a dinner table, the conversation animated and loving. A father helping his son with homework while the mother prepared coffee nearby. Children playing in a yard while parents watched from a porch swing, their faces filled with contentment. And Emma was there too, exactly as she'd been that morning, wearing the same purple sweater and gap-toothed grin, reaching toward him with small arms that carried all the trust in the world. "Daddy, there you are. I've been waiting." James nearly stepped through the doorway before catching himself. The Emma in the shadow vision looked exactly right, moved exactly right, sounded exactly right. But her eyes held the same emptiness he'd seen in Ashley's face. "She's not real," he whispered. "She's real enough," Ashley replied. "She's your love for Emma given form, preserved forever exactly as it is right now. No growing up, no teenage rebellion, no college departure, no wedding that takes her away to her own family. Just your little girl, loving her daddy for all eternity." James closed his eyes, feeling tears trace hot lines down his cheeks. The temptation was overwhelming, to step through that doorway and never again have to worry about Emma outgrowing him, about Sarah getting sick, about all the 1,000 ways life could shatter the happiness he'd built. But then he remembered Emma's real laugh from that morning, the way she'd insisted on helping pack his sandwiches even though she'd gotten more peanut butter on the counter than on the bread. The imperfect, messy, gloriously real moment that no shadow-preserved memory could truly capture. "No," James said, stepping back from the void. "Emma deserves the chance to grow up, to make her own mistakes, find her own happiness, become whoever she's meant to become. Love isn't about holding on forever. It's about knowing when to let go." The shadow walls began to pulse with anger, contracting around the clearing like the inside of a closing fist. Ashley's face showed disappointment rather than surprise. "You're choosing to go back to uncertainty," she said. "Back to a world where the people you love can be taken from you at any moment." "Yes," James said firmly. "I'm choosing to go back to life." James had spent 12 years as a forest ranger, and in that time he'd learned to read terrain like a language. Even in supernatural circumstances, certain rules seemed to apply. Water flows downhill, game trails follow the path of least resistance, and every forest has its own internal logic. The shadows might be able to manipulate his compass and GPS, but they couldn't change the fundamental geography of Olympic National Forest. He pulled out his topographical map, studying it by the strange, filtered light that penetrated the shadow walls. Mile marker 4-1, where Ashley's tracks had vanished, lay approximately 2 miles northeast of this clearing. The Solduke River ran east-west through this section, and even in October the flow would be strong enough to create audible current. If he could reach the river, he could follow it back to the main trail system. James shouldered his pack and started walking directly toward what his internal compass told him was east, ignoring Ashley's protests and the increasingly frantic calls of his shadow daughter. "You can't leave," Ashley called after him. "The shadows won't let you. They'll follow you home." James paused at the edge of the clearing. "Then I'll have to make sure they don't catch me." He broke into a run, crashing through undergrowth and leaping fallen logs with the desperate energy of a father trying to get home to his family. Behind him, The shadow walls collapsed inward with a sound like tearing fabric, and the darkness began to give chase. The shadows moved like living smoke, flowing around trees and over rocky outcrops with impossible speed. They whispered as they pursued him, using Emma's voice, Sarah's voice, his own mother's voice. Every person he'd ever loved calling his name, begging him to stop running and come home to them. But James had been running these trails since Emma was born, building his endurance so he'd always be strong enough to carry her when she got tired on family hikes. His legs found their rhythm. His breathing settled into the pattern that could sustain him for miles. And then he heard it, the distant sound of running water. Salt Duke River. Real, flowing, natural water that belonged to the world of sunlight and responsibility and imperfect, beautiful life. James crashed through a final screen of ferns and found himself on the riverbank. The water ran clear and cold, chattering over stones worn smooth by countless years of current. He'd never seen anything more beautiful. Behind him, the pursuing shadows gathered at the forest edge but seemed unable or unwilling to approach the flowing water. They pooled like oil at the boundary between trees and riverbank, reaching toward him with tendrils that dissipated inches from the water's edge. James didn't waste time questioning this apparent limitation. He turned downstream and began following the river at a steady jog, using game trails when available, and wading through shallows when necessary. The October sun was setting by the time he reached the first familiar landmark, a distinctive granite boulder marked with survey tags. From here, it was less than a mile back to the main trail system. James keyed his radio, hardly daring to hope. "Base, this is Hartwell. Do you copy?" Static answered him for several long seconds, then, "Hartwell, where the hell have you been? We lost contact with you 6 hours ago. Search and rescue is en route to your last known position." James nearly collapsed with relief. "I'm okay. I'm about a mile from the Salt Duke trailhead following the river back. Call off search and rescue. I'm coming home." "Roger that. Status on the missing hiker?" James looked back toward the forest where shadows pooled unnaturally deep between the trees despite the setting sun. Somewhere in those shadows, Ashley Morrison continued her eternal vigil, calling others home to a darkness that promised love without loss. "Negative contact," James replied. "No trace found. Recommend expanding the search area tomorrow with full teams." He couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe him? And more importantly, what good would it do? Ashley was beyond rescue now, and the shadow things seemed bound by rules that kept them from venturing far from their forest domain. At least he hoped they were bound by rules. James sat in his patrol vehicle, writing his official report by the dome light while waiting for his hands to stop shaking enough to hold a pen properly. Around him, the familiar sounds of evening filled the air. Traffic on Highway 101, a distant train whistle, the ordinary noise of a world that continued spinning despite the darkness he'd encountered. His report would be factual but incomplete. Tracked subject to mile 4.1 where trail sign was lost. Expanded search radius through mile 8.7 with negative results. Equipment failure resulted in loss of communication for approximately 6 hours. No evidence of foul play or injury found. Recommend continuation of search with additional personnel and K9 units. It was a lie of omission, but it was the only lie he could live with. James's cell phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did it go today? Emma saved you some meatloaf. We love you." He typed back with fingers that still trembled slightly. "Coming home now. Tell Emma I love her too. See you both in an hour." As he started the engine, James caught a glimpse of movement in his rearview mirror. For just a moment, Ashley Morrison stood at the edge of the trailhead parking lot, looking exactly as she had in the family photograph Margaret had provided. Young, smiling, full of life and promise. Then she raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning, and faded back into the gathering darkness. James drove home through the October evening, fighting the urge to speed, forcing himself to obey traffic laws and stop signs, and all the small, important rules that govern the world of the living. With every mile that passed between him and the forest, he felt the grip of ordinary reality reasserting itself. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the events of the day had taken on the quality of a vivid dream, terrible and real, But somehow separate from his normal existence, Emma met him at the door, launching herself into his arms with the complete trust of a child who has never doubted that her daddy would come home to her. She smelled like soap and strawberry shampoo and the indefinable sweetness of childhood. "Daddy, did you find the lost lady?" James held his daughter close, feeling her warm, solid reality anchor him to the world he'd chosen over shadow promises. "No, sweetheart. But sometimes people find their own way home. Will you tell me a story before bed?" "Of course." James carried Emma toward the house where Sarah waited in the doorway with dinner warming in the oven and all the ordinary, precious complications of real life spread out before them like a feast. Behind them, the Olympic National Forest stretched away into darkness, holding its secrets beneath ancient trees. And in that darkness, patient as stone, the shadows waited for the next hiker who loved someone enough to risk everything to answer their call. But tonight, James was home. Tonight, his family was safe. And tonight, that was enough. The official search for Ashley Morrison continued for 2 more weeks before being classified as a presumed fatality. Margaret Morrison established a scholarship fund in her daughter's name and visits the Solduke trailhead every year on the anniversary of Ashley's disappearance. James continues working as a forest ranger, but he's never returned to the Solduke trail system. When hikers go missing in that area, he assigns other rangers to the search, citing equipment conflicts or scheduling issues. On clear nights when the moon is dark and the forest is still, James sometimes wakes to find Emma standing at her bedroom window, looking out toward the distant mountains. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" he asks. "Just listening, Daddy," Emma always replies. "Someone's calling, but I can't tell who it is." And James takes her gently by the hand and leads her back to bed, pulling the curtains closed and leaving the nightlight burning until morning. Because some calls, no matter how sweetly they sing, are not meant to be answered. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., cutting through Michael Torres's first sip of coffee like a serrated blade through silence. 3 months into his assignment at Olympic National Park, he still wasn't accustomed to how quickly emergencies could shatter the mountain tranquility. "Ranger Torres, this is dispatch. We have a missing person report, priority 1. Michael set down his ceramic mug, the one his sister had given him with "World's Okayest Ranger" printed in faded letters, and reached for his radio. The ranger station felt smaller in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that seemed to press closer each morning. "Go ahead, dispatch." 22-year-old female Sarah Chen failed to return from a solo day hike yesterday on the Whisper Hollow Trail. Family called it in an hour ago. Last seen around 2 p.m. near the trailhead. Michael pulled up the digital map on his computer. Whisper Hollow Trail, a moderate 4.2-mile loop that wound through old-growth forest before connecting to several backcountry routes. He'd hiked it twice since arriving, noting the way shadows lingered longer there than other trails, how the canopy grew so thick that GPS signals weakened to mere suggestions. "Weather conditions?" he asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. Temperature dropped to 38 degrees overnight. Rain started around midnight, expected to continue through noon. Visibility's going to be poor. Michael grabbed his gear bag, mentally cataloging its contents. Garmin GPS, emergency medical kit, high-powered flashlight, emergency blanket, flares. Standard search protocol equipment, though something about this call felt different from the routine lost hiker scenarios he'd handled before. "I'm en route to meet the family. ETA 20 minutes. "Copy that, Michael." "Yeah?" "The reporting party mentioned some unusual circumstances. You'll want to speak with them directly." The radio fell silent, leaving Michael alone with questions that multiplied like frost crystals on his windshield. Unusual circumstances. In his previous assignments at Yellowstone and Glacier, that phrase typically meant suicide attempts or domestic situations. Here in Olympic's remote corridors, he was still learning what unusual might mean. Michael loaded his equipment into the park service truck, a well-worn Ford F-150 that had seen better decades. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, headlights carving pale tunnels through the morning mist. As he navigated the winding Forest Service roads, Douglas firs and western hemlocks pressed close on both sides, their branches interlacing overhead like arthritic fingers. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the Whisper Hollow trailhead parking area. A silver Subaru Outback sat alone under a weather-beaten information kiosk, its rear window decorated with university parking stickers and a faded Coexist bumper decal. Michael's headlights swept across two figures huddled near the kiosk, an elderly Asian man in a navy windbreaker and a middle-aged woman wearing hiking boots and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Chen? Michael approached with his flashlight aimed down, a gesture learned from countless similar encounters. Keep the light low, the voice calm, the questions gentle but direct. Yes, thank you for coming so quickly. The woman stepped forward, extending a trembling hand. I'm Linda, Sarah's mother. This is my husband, David. David Chen nodded but remained silent, his attention fixed on the trail entrance where yellow caution tape fluttered in the morning breeze like prayer flags. Tell me about yesterday, Michael said, pulling out his notepad. When did you last speak with Sarah? She texted me around noon, Linda said, fishing a smartphone from her jacket pocket. Look, she sent this. Michael examined the screen. The message read, Beautiful up here. Going to explore the side trail near mile marker 3. Signal's getting weak. Love you. Side trail near mile marker 3? Michael frowned. His mental map of Whisper Hollow showed no official side trails at that location, only game paths and old logging roads that had been closed for decades. That's what we thought was strange. David spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an accent that suggested English as a second language. Sarah is very careful hiker. She always stays on marked trails. Had she hiked this area before? Never, Linda said. We're from Portland. This was her first time in Olympic. She's completing her master's thesis on old-growth forest ecology at PSU. Wanted to collect some field data. Michael made notes, filing away details that might become important. First-time visitor, academic research, exploring unmarked areas. The rain had started again, fat drops drumming against his ranger hat brim. You mentioned unusual circumstances to dispatch? Linda and David exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication, the kind of shorthand that develops between long-married couples. Show him the voicemail, David urged quietly. Linda's fingers trembled as she navigated to her voicemail. She left this message yesterday around 4 p.m. We didn't see it until later because we were at dinner. She pressed play and held the phone between them. Sarah's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, distorted by poor reception and background noise. Mom, I'm not sure where I am. The trail split and I followed what looked like the main path, but now I'm in this clearing and there are structures here. Old buildings, maybe. And Mom, there are people here, but they're not. They won't answer when I call to them. They're just standing around this big stone circle, and they keep looking at me but won't respond. I'm getting scared. I'm going to try to head back to the main trail, but if you get this and I'm not back by 8, call the Rangers, okay? I love you. The message ended with a click that sounded final as a coffin lid closing. Michael replayed the voicemail twice, listening for background details. Beneath Sarah's voice, he could hear wind through trees, distant sounds that might have been voices or might have been water running over rocks. The reception quality suggested she'd been in a dead zone, not uncommon in Olympic's deeper valleys, where cellular towers couldn't penetrate the terrain's folds and the forest's density. Old buildings, he mused aloud. Stone circle. We looked online, Linda said. There's no mention of historical structures on the Whisper Hollow Trail, no archaeological sites, no old homesteads. Michael nodded, though his mind was already reaching for explanations. Olympic Peninsula had been logged extensively in the early 1900s. Forgotten work camps, abandoned equipment, forgotten graves, all possibilities. But stone circles suggested something else entirely. I'm going to start the search now, he said. Trail conditions will deteriorate if this rain continues. Do you have a recent photo of Sarah? Linda handed him a printed photograph, a young woman with shoulder-length black hair, wearing a green fleece jacket and smiling beside a waterfall. Sarah Chen looked like hundreds of other graduate students Michael had seen in national parks. Enthusiastic, prepared, intelligent enough to stay safe, but curious enough to sometimes push boundaries. "We'll find her," he said, though the words felt heavy with promise he might not be able to keep. As the Chen family drove away in their Subaru, Michael stood alone in the growing daylight, studying the Whisper Hollow trailhead. The wooden sign, weathered by decades of mountain weather, listed standard warnings. Stay on designated trails. Carry adequate water. Weather conditions can change rapidly. Tell someone your planned route. Sarah had followed most of those guidelines. She'd carried water, informed her parents of her general location, checked weather conditions. But she'd also been drawn off the designated trail by something. Curiosity, research needs, or perhaps something else entirely. Michael shouldered his pack and started up the trail, his boots finding purchase on the muddy path. The forest closed around him like a living thing, Douglas firs rising like cathedral pillars into the morning mist. After 3 months in Olympic, he was still learning to read its moods, to distinguish between the normal sounds of an ancient ecosystem and the warnings that something had gone wrong. Behind him, his truck sat alone in the parking area. Ahead, somewhere in 20,000 acres of wilderness, Sarah Chen was either alive and waiting for rescue, or had become another statistic in the Park Service's missing person files. The rain continued to fall, washing away whatever tracks she might have left. Mile marker 3 stood like a green metal sentinel beside a bend in the trail where Whisper Hollow Creek cut close to the path. Michael paused there, consulting his GPS and studying the terrain. According to his device, elevation was 2,247 feet. Coordinates 47 degree 49 23.7 N, 124 degree 1245.8 W. The official trail continued northwest, following the creek's meander toward its eventual junction with the Sol Duke River. But to his left, barely visible through a curtain of sword ferns and salmonberry bushes, Michael spotted what Sarah must have seen, a faint path leading into darker forest. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Ranger Torres. I'm at mile marker 3 on Whisper Hollow Trail. I've located what appears to be an unofficial trail heading northeast from the main route." "Copy that. Any signs of the missing person?" Michael crouched beside the path entrance, examining the ground. The overnight rain had turned the forest floor into a canvas that recorded every passage. There, a partial boot print in the mud, showing the distinctive waffle pattern of a hiking sole. Size looked about right for a woman's boot. Possible footprint evidence. "I'm proceeding up the side trail. Be advised, Weather Service is calling for temperatures to drop another 10 degrees by noon. Fog's rolling in from the coast." "Understood." Michael pushed through the salmonberry barrier, immediately noticing how the temperature dropped several degrees. The canopy here was older, thicker, with massive western hemlocks that had likely been growing when European explorers first mapped this coast. Sunlight filtered down in scattered coins, creating a cathedral effect that was both beautiful and somehow oppressive. The unofficial trail was more defined than he'd expected. Someone had cleared major obstacles and even built small log bridges over seasonal streams. This wasn't a game path or a random route carved by lost hikers. This was infrastructure, suggesting regular use over many years. After a quarter mile of steady climbing, Michael began encountering signs that this forest had been disturbed by human presence. A rusted axe head, half buried in the mossy ground. Stumps cut with tools rather than natural breakage, though their weathered condition suggested decades of abandonment. Most disturbing, he found a series of trees marked with symbols, crude carvings that had grown distorted as the bark healed around them. Michael photographed the symbols with his phone, though the poor reception meant he couldn't immediately send them to dispatch. The carvings reminded him of something he'd seen in a college anthropology course. Ritualistic markings used by various spiritual movements that had flourished in the Pacific Northwest during the 1960s and 70s. Communes, back-to-the-land movements, groups seeking mystical connection with the old-growth wilderness. Most of those communities had faded by the 1980s, their members returning to conventional society or moving to other regions. But some had persisted in the more remote areas, growing increasingly isolated and, according to law enforcement reports, increasingly unstable. The trail continued climbing through forest that felt ancient and undisturbed, despite the evidence of human marking. Michael's Garmin showed his elevation increasing steadily, 2,400 feet, then 2,500. He was moving into terrain that didn't appear on standard hiking maps, following a route that existed in some administrative limbo between official parkland and forgotten access road. After 45 minutes of hiking, Michael heard voices ahead. He stopped, listening carefully. The sounds were definitely human, multiple people speaking, though he couldn't make out words over the distance and forest noise. But Sarah's voicemail had mentioned people who wouldn't respond to her calls. People standing around a stone circle who would only stare at her. Michael unclipped his radio, keeping the volume low. Dispatch, I've encountered voices approximately 2 miles up the unofficial trail from mile marker 3. Proceeding with caution to investigate. Copy that. Do you need backup? He considered the question. Standard protocol for search and rescue called for backup when encountering unknown individuals in remote areas, especially when a missing person case might involve foul play. But radio response times in this terrain would be measured in hours, not minutes. If Sarah was injured or in immediate danger, delay could prove fatal. Negative on backup for now. We'll maintain radio contact. Michael continued forward more cautiously, using the enormous tree trunks as cover while advancing toward the voices. The forest floor here was carpeted in moss so thick it muffled his footsteps, creating an almost supernatural quiet, broken only by the distant human sounds and the whisper of wind through ancient needles. The trail emerged into a clearing roughly 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by trees so massive they seemed to predate recorded history. In the center of the clearing stood exactly what Sarah's voicemail had described, a circle of standing stones, each about 6 feet tall, arranged with obvious intentionality around what appeared to be a fire pit. And around the stone circle, just as Sarah had reported, stood people. Michael counted 8 individuals, ranging from teenagers to elderly adults, all dressed in simple clothing that looked handmade. Rough wool, undyed cotton, leather that had been worked by hand rather than machine. They stood motionless around the stone circle, facing inward, completely silent despite the conversation sounds he'd been hearing moments before. None of them acknowledged Michael's presence, even though he was standing in plain sight at the clearing's edge. "Hello," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the open space. "I'm Ranger Torres with the National Park Service. I'm looking for a missing hiker named Sarah Chen." No response. The 8 figures continued their silent vigil around the stones, as motionless as the monuments they surrounded. Michael approached more closely, studying their faces. The youngest appeared to be about 16, with the kind of hollow-cheeked appearance that suggested inadequate nutrition. The oldest was a woman whose gray hair hung in braids to her waist, her skin weathered by decades of outdoor living. Between them, men and women of various ages, all sharing the same distant, unfocused expression. "Excuse me," Michael tried again, stopping about 10 feet from the nearest figure, a middle-aged man with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. "I'm searching for a missing person, a young woman named Sarah Chen. Have you seen her?" The bearded man's eyes moved to Michael's face, but there was no recognition there, no indication that he'd processed the question. His gaze felt like looking into deep water, something present but unreachable. Michael circled the group slowly, trying to get a better understanding of what he was witnessing. The stone circle itself was clearly ancient, not Native American construction based on its style, but definitely predating recent settlement. The stones were granite, probably quarried from the same mountains that surrounded them, arranged with astronomical precision that suggested sophisticated knowledge of solar and stellar movements. But the fire pit in the center was recently used. Ash and charcoal, still faintly warm to Michael's touch when he knelt to examine it. And around the pit's perimeter, carved into the earth, were symbols that matched what he'd photographed on the marked trees. "Where is Sarah Chen?" Michael asked more forcefully, standing to address the entire group. "A young woman came here yesterday. She left a voicemail message describing this exact location and these exact people. What happened to her?" For the first time, one of the figures responded. The elderly woman with braided hair turned to face him directly, her eyes focusing with an intensity that made Michael's skin crawl. "She joined us," the woman said in a voice like wind through dried leaves. She understood the calling. What calling? Where is she now? But the woman's eyes had already gone distant again, her attention returning to the stone circle as if Michael had never spoken. Michael keyed his radio, moving back toward the clearing's edge. "Dispatch, I've located what appears to be a religious community in an unauthorized encampment approximately 2 miles from mile marker 3. 8 individuals, age range from teenage to elderly. They claim knowledge of the missing person but won't provide details. Requesting immediate backup and possibly law enforcement support." Static answered him. Michael checked his radio's battery, full charge. He tried again with the same result. Dead air where dispatch's voice should be. The clearing had gone completely silent. When Michael turned back toward the stone circle, all 8 figures were staring directly at him. "She came seeking answers." The elderly woman spoke again, her voice carrying clearly across the distance, though she hadn't raised her volume. "The forest called to her, just as it called to us, just as it's calling to you now. I need you to take me to Sarah Chen immediately," Michael said, his hand moving instinctively toward the pepper spray on his belt. "This is a federal investigation. Interfering with a search and rescue operation is a felony." The woman smiled, an expression that contained no warmth. "There are older laws than federal ones, Ranger Torres. Laws written in stone and root, in the movement of stars and the turning of seasons. Sarah came to understand this. She chose to stay." "People don't just choose to disappear," Michael said. "They have families, responsibilities, lives outside of whatever this is." "Do they?" The woman's head tilted slightly, bird-like. "Or do they simply convince themselves they do, until something true calls them back to what they've always known they belong to?" Michael realized that while he'd been focused on the elderly woman, the other 7 figures had begun moving. Not toward him, but in a slow, deliberate pattern around the stone circle, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to resonate with something deeper than sound. And beneath their measured pace, Michael began to hear something else. A voice, distant but distinct, calling his name. "Michael, Michael, help me." Sarah's voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the clearing's far edge. "Sarah!" Michael shouted, starting toward the voice's source. "Sarah, I'm here. I'm coming." But as he moved away from the stone circle, the elderly woman's laughter followed him. A sound like branches breaking in winter wind. "She's learning," the woman called after him. "Learning to use what the forest teaches, but some lessons take longer than others to understand fully." Michael plunged into the forest beyond the clearing, following Sarah's voice as it continued to call for help. Behind him, the rhythmic footsteps around the stone circle grew faster, more insistent, creating a percussion that seemed to make the very trees pulse with unnatural life. He was no longer just conducting a search and rescue operation. He was entering a situation that his training had never prepared him for, one where the missing person might not want to be found, and where the line between victim and something else entirely was becoming increasingly unclear. The voice calling his name grew closer, more desperate. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Michael began to wonder if he was being led toward Sarah Chen, or toward something wearing her voice like a mask. The voice led Michael deeper into forest that felt increasingly wrong with each step. The trees here were older than those in the clearing, ancient giants whose trunks required 4 people holding hands to encircle, their canopy so dense that his GPS signal vanished entirely. The air itself seemed thicker, heavy with moisture, and something else he couldn't identify. A sweetness that reminded him uncomfortably of flowers left too long in a closed room. "Michael, please. I'm hurt." Sarah's voice came from ahead, always just ahead, leading him along what might once have been a trail but was now barely a suggestion of cleared ground winding between massive root systems and fallen logs that had been decomposing for decades. Michael tried his radio again, nothing but static, as if the very forest was interfering with electronic communication. His cell phone showed 0 bars and a battery that had inexplicably dropped from 90% to 30% in the past hour. "Sarah, keep talking, I'm following your voice." No response this time. The forest had gone silent except for his own breathing and the soft squelch of his boots in ground that was less mud than organic decay, layers upon layers of fallen needles, leaves, and bark that had been slowly composting for generations. Michael paused to check his compass, an analog backup he always carried. The needle spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. He tapped the glass, thinking it might be stuck, but the needle continued its aimless rotation. Either he'd encountered some kind of magnetic anomaly, not unheard of in areas with heavy mineral deposits, or something else was interfering with navigation. A sound reached him from behind, voices chanting in a language he didn't recognize, the words carrying clearly through the still air despite the distance. The religious community from the clearing had resumed some kind of ceremony, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to follow natural rhythms. Wind gusts, the creaking of ancient wood, the distant sound of water flowing over stone. Michael pressed forward, following the faint path as it wound between trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel effect. The light here was green and submarine, filtered through so many layers of needles that it felt borrowed rather than direct. He began to notice more evidence of human habitation, pieces of rope tied to branches, flat stones arranged as stepping stones across seasonal streams, and more of the carved symbols he'd photographed earlier. But these symbols were different, more elaborate, cut deeper into the bark, and somehow more disturbing. While the earlier carvings had suggested spiritual seeking, these looked like warnings or boundaries. Michael photographed several before noticing that his camera was acting strangely. Some images appeared normal on the LCD screen, but others showed distortions, shadows where none had been visible, or figures standing among the trees where he was certain no one had been present. "Michael." The voice came from directly ahead, very close now. Michael pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and found himself at the edge of another clearing, smaller than the stone circle site, but somehow more ominous. This space felt carved out of the forest rather than naturally occurring, its boundaries too perfect, its silence too complete. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made Michael's breath catch. A log cabin, but not the rustic frontier construction he might have expected. This building was older, its logs fitted with precision that suggested master craftsmanship, its roof covered with moss and small trees that had taken root in the accumulated organic matter. Windows stared out like dark eyes, their glass surfaces reflecting nothing despite the daylight. The cabin felt wrong in ways Michael couldn't immediately articulate. It was too well preserved for its apparent age, too symmetrical for something built in wilderness, too silent for a structure that should be creaking and settling like all old wooden buildings. "Sarah?" he called toward the cabin. "Are you in there?" Movement caught his attention at one of the windows, a pale face appearing briefly before vanishing back into the interior darkness. Definitely human, definitely watching him, but the glimpse had been too quick to identify features or even gender. Michael approached the cabin cautiously, noting details that increased his unease. The door was modern despite the building's aged appearance, heavy wood with metal hinges that showed no rust despite the forest's moisture. The steps leading to the porch were recently replaced, their lumber still showing saw marks. Someone had been maintaining this structure, keeping it functional despite its isolated location. He climbed the steps, noting how they didn't creak under his weight despite their apparent age. The porch boards were solid, well maintained, swept clean of the debris that should have accumulated in such a forested setting. Michael knocked on the door, 3 firm raps that echoed strangely, as if the sound was absorbed by the building's interior before it could properly resonate. "I'm Ranger Torres with the National Park Service. I'm conducting a search and rescue operation for Sarah Chen. I know someone is inside." The door opened before he'd finished speaking, swinging inward on silent hinges to reveal an interior lit by oil lamps and candles rather than electric lighting. The smell that emerged was the same sweetness he'd noticed in the forest but concentrated. Flowers, incense, and underneath it all something organic and cloying that made his stomach turn. A figure stood in the doorway. Not Sarah, but a man Michael hadn't seen among the group at the stone circle. Tall, probably in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed too pale for his weathered face. He wore the same simple clothing as the others: rough wool shirt, canvas pants, leather boots that looked handmade. "She's resting," the man said, his voice carrying the same distant quality Michael had noticed in the elderly woman. "The transition is difficult. She needs time to adjust." "Transition to what?" "I need to see Sarah Chen immediately. Her family is worried about her." The man smiled with the same warmthless expression Michael had seen at the stone circle. Family. Yes, she spoke of that concern. But she understands now that family is broader than blood, deeper than the shallow connections people make in the outside world. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside so I can perform a welfare check. This is not optional." Instead of complying, the man opened the door wider, revealing more of the cabin's interior. Michael could see a main room with handmade furniture, chairs carved from single pieces of wood, a table that looked hewn rather than built, shelves lined with books whose spines showed no titles. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls covered with more of the carved symbols, these ones painted in what looked like red ochre or dried blood. And in the far corner of the room, seated in a chair facing away from the door, was a figure with shoulder-length black hair wearing a green fleece jacket. Sarah. Michael pushed past the man and into the cabin before he could be stopped. "Sarah, are you all right?" The figure in the chair didn't respond to his call or turn around. Michael approached carefully, noting that while the green fleece looked like the jacket in Sarah's photo, something about the person wearing it was wrong. The posture was too still, the breathing too shallow, the complete lack of response to his voice too absolute. "Sarah?" Michael reached out to touch her shoulder. The figure slowly turned in the chair, and Michael found himself looking at Sarah Chen's face, but changed in ways that made his professional training scream warnings. Her eyes were the same pale, distant color he'd seen in the other community members, completely unfocused despite looking directly at him. Her skin had an waxy quality, as if she hadn't been eating or sleeping properly. Most disturbing, when she smiled at his approach, the expression looked learned rather than felt. "Hello, Michael," Sarah said in a voice that was definitely hers but somehow wrong, too controlled, too emotionless. "I've been waiting for you." "Sarah, I'm Ranger Torres. Your parents are worried about you. They called in a missing person report when you didn't return from your hike." "Missing?" Sarah repeated the word as if testing its meaning. "Yes, I was missing for a very long time before I came here. Missing from myself, missing from the truth, missing from the real family that was waiting for me." Michael felt his training take over, compartmentalizing his growing alarm into professional assessment. Possible scenarios: drug use, psychological break, coercion, Stockholm Syndrome, or some combination. Whatever was happening here, Sarah Chen was clearly not in a state to make rational decisions about her safety. "I need you to come with me, Sarah. We need to get you back to the trailhead, get you checked out by medical personnel, make sure you're okay." "I am more okay than I've ever been," Sarah said, her smile widening without gaining any warmth. "I've found my calling, Michael. The same calling that brought you here." "No calling brought me here. Your parents reported you missing, and it's my job to find lost hikers." The man who'd opened the door stepped closer, and Michael realized that during his conversation with Sarah, other figures had entered the cabin. The elderly woman from the stone circle stood near the door, along with two younger men Michael hadn't seen before. All of them watched him with the same pale, unfocused eyes, the same emotionless expressions. "Jobs are illusions," the elderly woman said. "Constructs designed to keep people separated from their true purposes. You felt it as soon as you entered our forest, didn't you? The calling that goes deeper than duty, deeper than the shallow connections you've been trained to value." Michael's hand moved to his radio, though he knew it was useless. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. These people have no legal right to keep you here. You're a U.S. citizen on federal land. You can leave anytime you choose." "Choose," Sarah repeated, the same way she'd said, "missing." "Yes, I chose. I chose to stop running from what I've always known was true." "What truth?" Sarah stood from the chair, moving with the same measured, deliberate pace Michael had observed in the others. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed borrowed from someone else. The truth that the forest remembers what people have forgotten, that there are older ways of being, older families, older purposes than the one society tries to force on us. The truth that some of us were never meant for the outside world. Michael backed toward the door, keeping all the figures in sight. Sarah, you've been missing for less than 24 hours. Whatever these people have told you, whatever you think you've discovered, you need time away from here to process it clearly. Time. The elderly woman laughed. You still think in such limited terms? Sarah has been with us much longer than a day. She's been coming here in dreams for months, called by something deeper than conscious choice. Yesterday was simply when her physical body caught up with where her spirit had already committed. The implications of that statement hit Michael like a physical blow. If these people had been in contact with Sarah before her hiking trip, if they'd been influencing her somehow, then this wasn't a missing person case. It was abduction, possibly kidnapping, definitely false imprisonment. Sarah, did you know about this place before you came hiking yesterday? Did any of these people contact you before your trip? For the first time, Sarah's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. The dreams were just dreams. Graduate school stress, research pressure. I thought they were just my subconscious working through anxiety. What dreams? Dreams of this place. Dreams of the forest calling me home. Dreams of finding a family that understood what I was truly meant to become. Her voice was growing stronger, more confident, as if rehearsing a lesson she'd been taught. Dreams of leaving behind the illusion that academic achievement or parental approval could ever satisfy the deeper hunger. Michael realized he was witnessing some form of psychological conditioning, possibly enhanced by isolation, sleep deprivation, or psychoactive substances. Sarah Chen hadn't simply gotten lost on a hiking trail. She'd been recruited by what appeared to be a cult operating in the remote areas of Olympic National Park. Sarah, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with me voluntarily. If you refuse, I'm authorized to place you in protective custody for a mental health evaluation. The elderly woman stepped between Michael and Sarah, her pale eyes now focused with laser intensity. You have no authority here, Ranger Torres. This is sacred ground, older than your government, governed by laws your people have forgotten. Ma'am, you're on federal property. The National Park Service has full jurisdiction here, and I'm placing all of you under investigation for kidnapping and false imprisonment. The woman's smile was predatory. Are we on federal property? Are you certain? Michael fumbled for his GPS device, knowing it wouldn't work, but needing to try anyway. The screen showed no signal, no coordinates, no indication of his location relative to known landmarks. His compass continued its useless spinning. The boundaries are not what your maps claim, the woman continued. There are places in these mountains that were never ceded, never conquered, never properly claimed by governments that last a few centuries and call themselves permanent. We are the inheritors of older treaties, older claims. That's not how federal law works. Federal law, one of the younger men interrupted, assumes that all land can be owned, that all people want to be governed, that all families are biological rather than spiritual. We reject those assumptions. Michael was rapidly running out of options. He was outnumbered, cut off from communication, surrounded by people who showed signs of serious psychological disturbance, and responsible for a missing person who claimed she no longer wanted to be found. His training covered many scenarios, but not this combination of factors. Sarah, he tried one final appeal. Your parents love you. They're terrified that something has happened to you. Even if you've decided you want to live differently, you owe them at least a conversation, at least the knowledge that you're alive and safe. For a moment, Sarah's eyes cleared, showing something that looked like the person in the photograph her mother had given him. My parents? Yes, I should. They must be... She will contact them when she's ready, the elderly woman said firmly. When she's completed the transition and can explain in ways they might understand. Forcing that conversation now would only cause unnecessary pain for everyone involved. That's not your decision to make, Michael said. Sarah is an adult. She has the right to make her own choices about communication with her family. Rights? The woman laughed. Another illusion. Sarah has moved beyond rights and into responsibilities, to herself, to her new family, to the forest that called her home. The oil lamps in the cabin flickered, and Michael realized that full darkness was falling outside. He'd been in the forest longer than he'd thought, pursuing voices and following trails that seemed to lead always deeper into territory his maps didn't acknowledge existed. "I'm leaving," Michael announced, "and I'm taking Sarah with me. Anyone who interferes will be charged with obstruction of a federal investigation." He stepped toward Sarah, intending to take her arm and guide her toward the door, but she moved away from him with fluid precision that suggested she'd anticipated his action. "I'm not going with you, Michael," she said, her voice now completely calm, completely certain. "This is where I belong. This is what I was always meant to become." Michael found himself facing a choice his training hadn't prepared him for. Leave alone and report the situation, hoping backup could return to find the cabin and its inhabitants still present. Or stay and risk becoming trapped in a situation he didn't understand with people who showed clear signs of dangerous psychological instability. The decision was made for him when the elderly woman stepped aside, revealing that the cabin door had closed without him noticing, and when he turned the handle, it didn't move. "The choice is no longer yours to make," the woman said softly. "The forest has decided what it needs from you, just as it decided what it needed from Sarah." Michael was no longer conducting a search and rescue operation. He was trapped in a remote cabin with people whose grip on reality appeared tenuous at best, responsible for a missing person who no longer wanted to be found, cut off from communication and backup. Outside the cabin windows, full darkness had fallen, and somewhere in that darkness he could hear voices beginning to chant again. More voices than he'd seen people, rising from multiple directions, surrounding the cabin with sound that felt both ancient and malevolent. The forest had not given up its secrets easily. Now Michael was beginning to understand that it might not give him up easily either. The chanting outside the cabin grew stronger as the night deepened, voices harmonizing in patterns that seemed to follow some internal rhythm Michael couldn't identify. He tried the door again, locked from outside with what sounded like a heavy wooden bar. The windows were too small to climb through, their glass too thick to break easily without tools he didn't have. "How many people are out there?" Michael asked, though he wasn't sure anyone would answer honestly. "Enough," the elderly woman said, settling into one of the hand-carved chairs as if this were a normal evening gathering. "We are a large family, Ranger Torres. Larger than you might think possible in such a remote place." Sarah had returned to her chair, sitting with the same unnatural stillness Michael had observed when he first entered the cabin. The other figures arranged themselves around the room, creating a loose circle with Michael at its center. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows that made their faces appear to shift and change, sometimes looking human, sometimes suggesting something else entirely. "Sarah," Michael tried again, keeping his voice calm and professional, "I need you to think clearly about what's happening here. You came hiking yesterday as a graduate student working on a thesis. 24 hours later, you're claiming to have found a new family and a new purpose. That kind of radical change doesn't happen naturally, doesn't it?" Sarah's head turned toward him with mechanical precision. "People have religious conversions, epiphanies, moments of clarity that change their entire lives. Why should this be different?" "Because religious conversions don't typically involve isolation in remote cabins with people who won't let you leave." "Who said I want to leave?" Michael pulled out his notepad, trying to maintain some semblance of official procedure. "Sarah, I'm documenting that you are being held against your will by a group of individuals who have prevented both your departure and mine from this location. This constitutes kidnapping under federal law." The elderly woman laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from bone. "Your laws, your definitions, your bureaucratic certainties. Tell me, Ranger Torres, what makes you so confident that your version of reality is the correct one?" "Evidence," Michael said firmly.
Sarah's family reported her missing. She left a voicemail indicating distress. "I found her in the company of people who won't allow her to leave freely. These are facts." Facts. The woman stood and moved closer to him, her pale eyes reflecting the lamplight in ways that seemed impossible. Here's a fact. Sarah began having dreams about this place 6 months ago.
Here's another fact. She changed her thesis topic 3 times, each revision bringing her closer to research that would require fieldwork in Olympic National Park. Here's a third fact. She applied for hiking permits to areas she'd never visited, driven by urges she couldn't explain. Michael looked at Sarah, who was staring at her hands folded in her lap. Is that true? The dream started after I found an old book about Pacific Northwest folklore in the university library, Sarah said without looking up. I was researching something completely different, but the book was misfiled in my section. I started reading it and I couldn't stop thinking about the places it described. What book? Hidden Sanctuaries of the Olympic Peninsula, she said. Published in 1967 by someone named Dr. Marcus Thornfield. It described communities of people who had found ways to live in harmony with the forest, who had discovered truths that mainstream society wasn't ready to accept. The elderly woman nodded approvingly. Dr. Thornfield was one of us, though he left to document what he'd learned here. The book was meant to call those who were ready to understand, to plant seeds in minds that were prepared to grow beyond conventional limitations. Michael felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. You've been using that book to recruit people. Plant it where vulnerable individuals will find it, wait for them to become obsessed, then guide them here when they're psychologically prepared. We don't recruit, one of the younger men said. We simply make ourselves available to those who are already seeking. The forest calls to certain people, and we help them answer that call. How many people? Over the years? The elderly woman considered the question. Dozens. Some stay permanently, like Sarah is choosing to do. Others visit for periods of learning before returning to the outside world, carrying what they've learned back to help others recognize their own callings. Michael realized he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple missing person case. This appeared to be an organized group that had been operating in Olympic National Park for decades, possibly recruiting people through carefully placed literature and psychological manipulation, maintaining an unauthorized settlement in remote areas that weren't regularly patrolled. What happens to people who try to leave? And he asked. No one tries to leave, Sarah said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Once you understand what we found here, why would you want to return to the loneliness and confusion of the outside world? Michael studied her face, looking for signs of coercion or distress. What he saw instead was something more troubling. Complete conviction. The kind of certainty that suggested either profound psychological manipulation or genuine belief in something he couldn't understand. Sarah, describe your typical day here. We rise with the sun, she began, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality. Morning meditation around the stone circle, then breakfast prepared from food we grow and gather ourselves. Afternoon work, maintaining the buildings, tending the gardens, copying text by hand to preserve the wisdom we've accumulated. Evening gatherings where we share insights and discuss the day's spiritual progress. It sounds like monastery life, Michael observed. In some ways, the elderly woman agreed, but monasteries separate people from the world to focus on abstract spirituality. We integrate more fully with the natural world to understand practical spirituality, how to live in harmony with forces that modern people have forgotten exist. What forces? The consciousness that flows through old-growth forests, the intelligence that guides seasonal cycles, the wisdom that speaks through stone circles and sacred groves. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. Forces that indigenous peoples understood before European colonization, forces that a few Europeans learned to recognize before industrialization, made people forget their connection to anything larger than individual ambition. Michael noticed that the chanting outside had grown more complex, with different groups of voices weaving intricate harmonies that seemed to respond to the conversation inside the cabin. Whatever was happening out there, it involved more people than he'd seen, following patterns that suggested extensive preparation and coordination. How many people live here permanently? He asked. Our numbers fluctuate, the woman said evasively. Some stay for seasons, some for years, some for lifetimes. The forest provides for those who belong here and gently discourages those who don't, Discourages how? Instead of answering, the woman walked to one of the windows and gestured for Michael to join her. Reluctantly, he approached and looked out into the darkness. The forest around the cabin was alive with movement. Dozens of figures moved between the trees carrying torches or oil lamps, their lights creating a constellation of dancing points that extended far beyond what Michael would have expected. As his eyes adjusted, he could see that they were moving in deliberate patterns, not random wandering, but choreographed movement that suggested ritual or ceremony. "Tonight is special," the woman explained. "Sarah's formal welcome and your introduction to possibilities you hadn't considered. I don't want an introduction to anything. I want to complete my search and rescue mission and return Sarah safely to her family." "You keep talking about safety," Sarah said from behind him, as if what I was doing before was safe. Graduate school anxiety, career uncertainty, family pressure, romantic disappointments. Was that safety? Or was that just a slower form of dying? Michael turned back to face her, noting how her posture had changed. She sat straighter now, more alert, her eyes focused with intensity rather than the distant blankness he'd observed earlier. "Everyone goes through difficult periods," he said. "That doesn't mean abandoning everything you've worked for to join a commune in the wilderness." "A commune." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely amused expression he'd seen from her. "You still don't understand what this is, do you? Then explain it to me." Sarah stood and moved to a bookshelf lined with volumes that looked hand-bound, their covers showing no titles or publication information. She selected one and brought it back to where Michael stood. "Read this," she said, opening the book to a page covered with handwritten text in multiple languages. "Tell me what you see." Michael examined the page, recognizing some English words mixed with what looked like Latin, indigenous languages he couldn't identify, and symbols that might have been mathematical formulas or something else entirely. "It looks like research notes, multiple languages, scientific observations mixed with spiritual or philosophical commentary. Dr. Thornfield's original journals," the elderly woman said. "Written during his 18 months with us in 1965 and 1966, he came here as a skeptical anthropologist studying what he assumed were delusional backwoods communities. He left as someone who had experienced things that challenged every assumption he'd held about the nature of reality." Michael continued reading, finding passages that described experiments in what Thornfield called forest consciousness, attempts to document communication with the ecosystem itself, not as metaphor, but as literal exchange of information. Day 127. The response patterns are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or projection. When specific questions are posed during morning meditation at the stone circle, environmental responses occur within 24 hours that appear to address those questions directly. Temperature changes, wind patterns, animal behavior, even the timing of seasonal transitions seem to adjust in ways that provide guidance. Day 156. Margaret showed me the marking system they use to record what they call forest messages, symbols carved into trees that appear to change over time, not through human intervention, but through some natural process that alters the bark patterns in meaningful ways. I've photographed the same symbols weekly for 2 months. The changes are subtle but undeniable, and they correlate with decisions the community needs to make about food gathering, weather preparation, and conflict resolution. This is... Michael paused, trying to process what he was reading. Dr. Thornfield was documenting claims that the forest ecosystem can communicate with humans. Not claims, Sarah said quietly. Experiences. Repeatable, measurable experiences that produced practical results for community survival and spiritual development. Michael looked up from the journal to find all eyes in the cabin focused on him with expectant intensity. Outside, the chanting had evolved into something more complex. Individual voices weaving together to create harmonies that seemed to echo the rhythm of his own heartbeat. "Even if that were possible," he said carefully, "it wouldn't justify holding people against their will or preventing communication with their families." "No one is being held against their will," the elderly woman said, But some transitions require time away from external pressures that would interfere with the process. Sarah needs space to complete her understanding before she can explain it to people who haven't had similar experiences. How long? That depends on Sarah, the woman said. Some people integrate quickly. Others need months or even years to fully comprehend what they've accessed. Michael felt the weight of his situation settling around him like a physical thing. He was trapped in a remote cabin with people whose beliefs seemed genuinely held but potentially dangerous, responsible for a missing person who appeared to be undergoing some kind of psychological transformation, cut off from backup or communication, and surrounded by unknown numbers of people who considered themselves outside normal legal jurisdiction. Worse, he was beginning to understand that what he'd initially assumed was a simple case of kidnapping or cult recruitment might be something more complex, a community that had developed beliefs and practices based on experiences he couldn't easily dismiss as delusion. The journal in his hands contained detailed observations, measurements, sketches, and documentation that looked like legitimate research, even if the conclusions challenged everything he understood about the relationship between humans and natural environments. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "The same thing we wanted from Sarah," the elderly woman said. "Openness to possibilities you hadn't considered. Willingness to experience something before judging it. Time to understand what you've encountered before making decisions based on assumptions that might be incomplete. And if I refuse? Then you'll spend the night as our guest, and tomorrow we'll escort you back to the trail with a story about finding Sarah safe but choosing to extend her hiking trip for a few days." A lie. A simplification of events too complex for people who weren't present to understand accurately. Michael looked again at Sarah, who was watching him with an expression that seemed both compassionate and slightly predatory. "What's really happening here?" he asked her directly. "Something wonderful," she said. "Something that feels like coming home after being lost my entire life. Something that makes every other experience seem like preparation for arriving where I always belonged." The certainty in her voice was absolute, unshakable in a way that suggested either complete psychological manipulation or genuine transformation into something he couldn't comprehend. Outside the cabin, the chanting reached a crescendo that seemed to make the building itself vibrate with harmonic resonance. Then, abruptly, it stopped, leaving a silence so complete that Michael could hear his own breathing echo off the walls. "It's time," the elderly woman said, moving toward the door. "Time for what?" "For you to understand what Sarah has already discovered. For you to experience what Dr. Thornfield documented. For you to make an informed decision about what you found here." The door opened from outside, revealing figures holding torches that cast dancing light across their faces. Michael could see men and women of various ages, all wearing the same simple clothing, all watching him with the same expectant intensity. "Come with us," Sarah said, extending her hand toward him. "Let the forest show you what it showed me." Michael realized he had reached the moment that would define how this situation ended, and possibly whether he would return to his regular life or become another missing person in Olympic National Park's files. The hand Sarah offered looked perfectly normal, completely human, but something in her eyes suggested that what she was inviting him to experience might change him in ways he couldn't anticipate or reverse. Outside, the forest waited with its ancient secrets and its patient hunger for those willing to listen to voices older than civilization. Michael stared at Sarah's extended hand, weighing options that all seemed to lead away from the clear-cut resolution his training had taught him to expect. Accept her invitation and risk becoming another missing person. Refuse and face unknown consequences from people who clearly operated outside normal social boundaries. Try to force his way out and potentially escalate a tense situation into something violent. "What exactly are you asking me to experience?" he said. "A conversation," the elderly woman replied. "The same conversation Sarah had yesterday evening, the same one Dr. Thornfield documented, the same one everyone who stays here eventually shares." "With whom?" "With the forest itself." Michael looked around the cabin one final time, taking inventory of details he might have missed. The hand-carved furniture showing tool marks that suggested individual craftsmanship rather than mass production. The books whose bindings looked decades old but well-maintained. The oil lamps that cast steady light despite the evening breeze he could feel through gaps in the log construction. Everything suggested long-term habitation by people who had invested significant time and skill in creating a sustainable living situation. This wasn't a temporary cult compound or a recently established commune. This was a community that had existed long enough to develop sophisticated infrastructure and accumulated knowledge. "How long has this place been here?" he asked. "The stone circle?" The elderly woman considered his question. "Archaeological surveys would probably date it to pre-Columbian construction, though we've never invited archaeologists to examine it." The cabin was built in 1923 by a logging foreman who decided to stay after his crew moved on to other sites. He learned from local tribes, from the forest itself, from trial and error over 30 years of solitary living. What happened to him? He found others who were seeking the same kind of life. By the 1950s, there were 8 people living here permanently. By the 1960s, when Dr. Thornfield arrived, nearly 20. The numbers have fluctuated over the decades, but the community has maintained continuous presence for almost a century. Michael processed this information, realizing that if the woman was telling the truth, he'd stumbled upon something far more significant than a missing person case. A century-long community existing within Olympic National Park without official recognition or government oversight represented either the most successful hermit settlement in U.S. history or something else entirely. Why hasn't the Park Service discovered you before now? "Who says they haven't?" one of the younger men asked. "Some discoveries get officially documented, others get quietly managed through informal agreements that benefit everyone involved." Michael felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Olympic National Park encompassed nearly 1 million acres, much of it in remote wilderness areas that were surveyed only intermittently. A small, stable community that practiced sustainable living and caused no problems for neighboring areas might indeed be tolerated under unofficial arrangements that avoided bureaucratic complications. "Are you saying the Park Service knows you exist?" "We're saying that institutional knowledge isn't always the same as official policy," the elderly woman said carefully. "Some rangers over the decades have encountered our community and chosen to focus on issues that required more immediate attention. And others? Others have joined us," Sarah said quietly. "Michael, you're not the first person to find us while conducting search and rescue operations. You're not even the first ranger." That statement hit him with the force of recognition. During his briefing for the Olympic assignment, he'd been told about several rangers who had requested transfers or resigned unexpectedly over the years. Turnover was explained as typical for remote postings, but now he wondered if there might have been other factors. "How many rangers have disappeared?" "None have disappeared," the woman said firmly. "Several have chosen different life paths after discovering opportunities they hadn't previously considered. There's a difference." Michael looked at Sarah again, trying to see past the calm certainty in her expression to the graduate student who had left Portland 2 days ago. "Sarah, if you could send a message to your parents right now, what would you tell them?" "That I'm safe, that I'm happy, that I've found something I didn't know I was looking for," she said without hesitation. "That I need time to understand it fully before I can explain it in ways they might accept." "How much time?" "I don't know. Months, maybe years. However long it takes to integrate what I've learned here with what I knew before." "And if your parents can't accept not knowing where you are for months or years?" For the first time, Sarah's certainty flickered. "That would be difficult. I love my parents. I don't want to cause them pain." "Then come back with me," Michael urged. "Spend some time processing this experience. Talk to people you trust. Make sure you're thinking clearly before making such a major life decision." "I am thinking clearly," Sarah said, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "More clearly than I ever have." The elderly woman stepped closer to both of them, her presence somehow more commanding despite her small stature. "Sarah, doubts are natural at this stage. The pull of old connections is strong, even when we've outgrown them. But remember what you experienced yesterday during your first conversation with the forest. Remember what you learned about the difference between thinking clearly and thinking conventionally." Michael watched Sarah's expression shift back toward the distant certainty he'd observed earlier, as if the woman's words had activated some kind of programmed response. "What conversation?" he asked. "What exactly happens during this forest communication you keep referring to?" "The only way to understand is to experience it," the woman said. "Descriptions are inadequate for experiences that engage levels of perception most people never access. Try anyway." The woman studied his face for a long moment, apparently assessing something. "Very well. During deep meditation at the stone circle, particularly at dawn or dusk when natural light transitions create optimal conditions, some people begin to perceive information that doesn't come through normal sensory channels." "What kind of information?" "Guidance about decisions they need to make. Insights about life directions they should pursue. Understanding of connections between themselves and larger systems they hadn't recognized before. Sometimes practical knowledge about survival skills, plant properties, weather patterns, or animal behavior that proves accurate when tested." Michael recognized this as a description of what psychologists might call enhanced intuition, or subconscious processing made conscious through meditative practices. Not necessarily supernatural, but potentially profound for people seeking direction in their lives. And people interpret this as communication with the forest? People experience it as communication with something larger than their individual consciousness, the woman corrected. Whether you call that something the forest, or collective unconscious, or ecosystem intelligence, or God, depends on your conceptual framework. But it could be explained through known psychological and neurological processes. "It could be explained many ways," Sarah interjected. "The question is which explanation leads to the most useful results. For me, understanding it as forest communication has produced better outcomes than understanding it as psychological self-deception." Michael realized he was being drawn into a philosophical discussion that could continue indefinitely, without resolving his immediate situation. He was still trapped in a cabin surrounded by unknown numbers of people, still responsible for a missing person who claimed she no longer wanted to be found, still cut off from backup and communication. "I need to make a decision," he said aloud, more to himself than to the others. "Yes," the elderly woman agreed. "The same decision Sarah made, the same decision Dr. Thornfield made, the same decision everyone who encounters us eventually faces, whether to remain limited by assumptions about what's possible, or to explore possibilities that might expand those assumptions." Michael looked toward the door, where figures with torches waited patiently in the darkness. He could hear water running somewhere nearby, a stream or small waterfall that hadn't been audible from inside the cabin. Night sounds of the forest surrounded them. Wind through enormous trees, the distant call of what might have been an owl, the soft rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth. It was a beautiful setting, peaceful in ways that his daily life as a ranger rarely achieved. If these people had indeed found sustainable ways to live in harmony with such an environment, if they had developed practices that produced genuine spiritual fulfillment and practical wisdom, then their community represented something valuable, regardless of whether their explanations for it were literally accurate. But he was also a federal law enforcement officer who had encountered what appeared to be an unauthorized settlement, holding a missing person under circumstances that suggested psychological manipulation at best, criminal activity at worst. "If I agree to this conversation with the forest," he said carefully, "what guarantee do I have that I'll retain the ability to make independent decisions about my future?" "None," the woman said bluntly. "Any experience that expands your understanding of reality inherently changes your decision-making capacity. Education, travel, relationships, parenthood, military service, all of these alter how people perceive their options and priorities. Why should spiritual development be different? Because those other experiences don't typically require abandoning contact with family and career. Don't they?" Sarah asked. "How many people move across the country for college and maintain meaningful relationships with high school friends? How many people change careers and find their old professional network no longer relevant? How many people get married and discover their single friends no longer understand their priorities?" Michael recognized the logic while questioning its application. Those are gradual transitions with built-in support systems. What you're describing sounds more like sudden conversion that requires cutting ties with previous life entirely. Some transitions are gradual, the elderly woman acknowledged. Others require clean breaks from patterns that would prevent the change from taking full effect. Sarah's situation may be the latter. Or it may be that you've isolated her from influences that would help her think more clearly about what she's deciding. Yes, the woman agreed. Both could be true simultaneously. The question is which interpretation serves Sarah's long-term well-being more effectively. Michael looked at Sarah one more time, studying her face for signs of distress, coercion, or internal conflict. What he saw instead was someone who appeared genuinely at peace, genuinely certain about her choices, genuinely convinced that she had found something valuable. Either she was experiencing the most sophisticated form of psychological manipulation he'd ever encountered, or she had indeed discovered something that produced the kind of certainty and fulfillment most people spent their entire lives seeking. "If I refuse your invitation," he asked, "then tomorrow you'll wake up at the regular trailhead with memories of a strange dream and a report that Sarah extended her hiking trip but is safe," the woman said. "No harm to anyone, no complications for your career, no disruption of your normal life. And Sarah will make her own decision about when and how to contact her family, without pressure from people who haven't shared her experiences." Michael realized this was the moment. Everything depended on whether he trusted these people enough to risk experiencing whatever they wanted to show him, or whether he chose safety and returned to his regular life with questions that would never be answered. The hand Sarah held toward him remained steady, patient, completely normal in appearance. The torchlight dancing through the windows suggested a community gathered to witness whatever choice he made. The forest around them hummed with night sounds that felt both familiar and mysterious, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what the Lone Ranger would decide. Michael looked at Sarah one final time. "If I do this, if I experience whatever you want to show me, you'll consider returning to your parents even if only for a visit?" "I'll consider it," she said. "But Michael, I can't promise I'll choose what you think is best for me. I can only promise I'll make the choice from a place of fuller understanding than I had before." That was as close to a guarantee as he was likely to get, and if the experience these people offered was genuinely meaningful, if it provided insight that helped Sarah make better decisions about her life, then his role as a rescuer might be to ensure she had access to that insight, rather than preventing it. "All right," he said, reaching out to take her hand. "Show me what you want to show me." Sarah's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her, suggesting that beneath the programmed certainty was a person who still cared about making genuine connections with other people. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me enough to let me share what I've found." The cabin door opened, and cool night air flowed in, carrying scents of moss and cedar and something floral he couldn't identify. The figures with torches stepped aside to create a path leading into darkness that was somehow inviting, rather than threatening. Michael followed Sarah out of the cabin and into whatever lay waiting in the ancient forest, knowing that by morning he would either understand why she had chosen to stay, or become another missing person whose family would never learn what had really happened to him. The choice was made. All that remained was to discover what that choice would make of him. 3 months later, Ranger Captain Jennifer Walsh filed her final report on the missing persons case involving Sarah Chen and Michael Torres. Both individuals had been confirmed alive through authentic letters, requesting cessation of search efforts and asking to be left alone in their chosen way of life. The Olympic Peninsula's vast wilderness had claimed 2 more souls, not through tragedy, but through the mysterious pull of something ancient calling from the deep forest. Whether that call represented freedom or captivity, enlightenment or delusion, remained a question that could only be answered by those who chose to listen. In the end, some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some disappearances are chosen rather than suffered, and some forests hold secrets that civilization was never meant to fully understand. The Whisper Hollow Trail remains open to hikers, though rangers now pay closer attention to solo travelers and unofficial side paths. No missing person reports have been filed in the area since December 2018. But sometimes on quiet mornings when the mist hangs thick between the ancient trees, Park Service personnel report hearing voices calling from deep in the forest. Voices that sound almost human, speaking words in languages that seem both familiar and impossible to understand. The forest remembers everything, and some things that enter its embrace choose never to leave.